Sometimes being told to take a walk is more than just a diss. It's a threat, because when you do go for a nice long walk in the woods, a Wendigo might start flirting with you. And that's just not something I'm ready for. Enjoy this episode featuring scary hiker stories, and be sure to send me your scary story soon at darkstories.org. Specifically, send me your scary experiences with sea monsters. Also, for more scary goodness, follow and listen to Freaky Folklore and Redwood Bureau on your favorite podcasting apps. Now, let's begin. What we found in the forest. From Anonymous. This story takes place 9 years ago when I was 15. I live in a small town in northwest North Carolina. Myself, my dad, mom, and younger brother had just moved into a new house. I loved where we lived because it was a lot more rural than our previous house was. Plus, it was right down the street from my grandma's, where my dad grew up. We got to know our new neighbors a little, what few there were, like the guy who lived across the street from us named Dan. I say across the street, but in reality it was down a gravel driveway about half a mile into the woods. He offered to let me go hunting and hiking on his property. He owned quite a bit of forested land. Being from the southeast United States, I loved the outdoors, hiking and hunting especially. It's sort of a part of you when you live down here. One Saturday morning, I was able to convince my younger brother, who was 11 at the time, to go exploring through the woods with me. He was nowhere near as interested as me, but he would eventually agree. We told our parents where we were headed off to. They knew Dan and they agreed we could go, but gave us a time limit for when we had to be back home. I grabbed my binoculars, jacket, and blaze orange hat. This was just before cell phones got really popular, so I didn't have one just yet. Not that it would have helped much anyway. We set off down Dan's driveway. Once we were at his house, we let him know we were going for a little hike. He said to be careful. We thanked him and started off into the forest. The area I live in is very hilly, so hiking was tough going, but worth it. An hour into the hike, we walked up on a small but distinctive path that seemed to go on for a while. Feeling a bit nervous, but also curious, we decided to check it out. Heck, it was at least a break from the brush. We began walking down this winding path through the thick pine trees. Roughly 15 minutes into taking this path, we noticed a deer stand with camouflage netting around it. Now, it was early October, so immediately, I was happy to wear my blaze orange hat. You see, the season for hunting deer starts in late September here, so as a precaution you wear an article of orange clothing to make yourself stand out, as to not be mistaken for an animal. Well, being curious young teenagers, we decided to check it out. I climbed up first. It must have been about 20 feet up in the tree. When I got to the actual stand, luckily it was empty. I sat down and could just barely make out what appeared to be a house about 300 yards further into the woods. Blown away by this, I told my brother I wanted to take a closer look. He was a little apprehensive at first, but eventually he agreed. When we were about 100 yards out, we came up on a rundown Jeep off the side of the path. I have no idea how the heck it got all the way out there. Beyond that, straight up a large bank, there was the quote-unquote house. I'm using that term loosely as it was basically a shack. There were what appeared to be newspapers plastered all over every window and tape over the screen door. A blue tarp covered parts of the roof. There was an old run-down kid swing set off to the side, rusted into pieces. Standing there looking around, I began to smell something coming from near the house. Now, it wasn't a dead body kind of smell, like roadkill, but just a very strange smell that I couldn't describe. Visibly shaken, my brother was urging me to go back home, as it was nearing the time we'd have to head back in order to make it home before curfew. I began to slowly walk around this creepy shack. When we got to the rear of the building, I could see a small camper with an old-looking pickup truck parked near it, several 50-gallon steel barrels sitting all around, hoses, some backpacks, and a few coolers. There was a plume of smoke coming from the small camper, which is where I could tell the smell was coming from, and that smell was very strong at this point. Not seeing any people yet, I crept about 50 yards closer and could just make out two loud male voices coming from the camper. As I sat there with my binoculars, trying to figure out what was going on, it hit me like a sack of bricks. All the evidence pointed to some sort of illegal operation. If you catch my drift, my guess was they were making a certain substance. Coming to this realization of how much immediate danger we might be in, I turned to my brother and said in a calm voice, trying not to scare him, "We need to leave right now. Slowly, back out the way we came, and then run." As we started to turn around, I heard a loud yell coming from one of the men at the camper. I turned, and I saw him looking right at me. He was pointing. I figured we were far enough away the foliage would hide us, but then I remembered I was wearing that bright orange hat. I quickly stuffed it into my jacket pocket and looked up to see both men yelling and now waving guns around. At this point, I said screw the subtle tactics. We stood up and bolted. To my terror, I began to hear a dog barking, and I turned to see a huge dog, I'm guessing a Rottweiler by the color and shape. The men grabbed the chain it was on and began to head in our direction. The dog barked loudly, and the men waved guns around, saying all kinds of insane things. I remember looking down at my brother's face while we were running from those maniacs and their dog. He was in absolute shock now. Realizing that eventually the men with the dog would catch up to us and do God knows what, I went into survival mode and told my younger brother that we're going to have to hide in order to get away from them. We ran a little further and came up on a downed large oak tree off the side of the cleared path. Thinking swiftly, I told my brother to tuck himself as close up against the tree as he could and to be absolutely silent. He did so. I turned and ran faster than I ever had before to the edge of the creek. I tossed my bright orange hat to the other side of it and then went back to the tree. I tucked in right in front of my brother, quickly tossing leaves and sticks over us. We sat there, horrified, just waiting. We could hear their screaming and barking getting closer and closer. But, to our relief, they passed right by us, heading down to the creek. Being that the men were only about 30 yards away, I could make out the guy holding the dog's chain. He was tall, with lots of hair and a huge gray-black beard. He was wearing overalls. They spotted my hat and hopped across the creek. The shorter man then picked up my hat and said something along the lines of, "They can't be far. We were on top of them." Luckily, they both started off in the opposite direction of the way we needed to get back home. We waited a few more minutes until we could no longer hear their footsteps. Then, the two of us stood up and ran as fast as humanly possible through that terrain. It took us over an hour just to get back to my neighbor's house. He was outside working in his barn. When he saw our faces, I'm guessing he knew something was very wrong. He offered to give us a lift back up to our house, and we quickly accepted, not saying a word about what happened. I know this is a cliché, but we ended up keeping the whole thing a secret until years later, in fear that if we told anyone, we would get in trouble, and I'd never be allowed to go hiking or hunting again. Ignorant as heck, I know, but hey, we were dumb kids. A couple of years back, I told the whole story to my dad and my neighbor. My parents are divorced now. They were overall concerned, but chalked it up to us being kids, and how it was most likely other hunters. This wasn't the case. I know what we saw, and it wasn't other hunters. It was a couple of very dangerous men who had no problem with chasing down two children with firearms. I believe we're lucky to have made it back. I found new hunting land because the land has since been bought up by developers, and the trees have been logged. It's barren right now, but the county is in the process of building large homes on the site. All I can say is, hiking and being outdoors is fun and an important part of life. Just adventure with caution. The Hidden Pond. From Lon. I never really started taking hikes through the woods until my family adopted a dog when I was around 16. She was a yellow Labrador retriever and was always eager to go outside, and since we lived in a small country town, I'd often take her on dirt paths through the forest. But after nearly a year of walking the same routes over and over again, I began to wander more and more off the beaten trail. This led me to explore wide open fields, hidden meadows, and evergreen woods with the forest floor covered in dead pine needles. My dog was always beyond ecstatic to explore those areas, and frankly, I enjoyed it too. Then there came a day when our little adventures brought us to a rather unexpected spot deep in the woods. It was a pond, no larger than maybe 60 or 70 feet across, but entirely dark. There were no croaking toads to be heard, and it was perfectly still, like a mirror. The only thing I could see in that body of water was a large dead tree branch sticking out of its center like some sort of twisted limb. It was a mystical sight, and I spent some time quietly admiring it, standing as close as I dared, due to the surrounding soil being extremely muddy the closer you got to the dark pond. While I was enjoying myself, my dog wasn't. She kept whimpering, quickly moving back and forth along the pond's edge, sniffing loudly. I assumed it was the water itself that she was unhappy with, as she would often whine whenever I tried giving her a bath. But after a few minutes, she gave off a terrifying bark, the kind that hurts the ears with how high-pitched it is. I snapped at her to quiet down, but that only seemed to aggravate her more as she moved behind me and began to bark again. "Hey," I said, turning my head away from the pond and towards the dog, concerned that someone might hear her. After all, this was far out in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea if we were trespassing on private property. That's when it happened. Belle, my dog, went stock still and stared right past me towards the pond, ears perked up on high alert. Then I heard something move in the water. I spun back around, but only saw a sizable ripple disturb the surface of the dark water. The dead tree branch was gone. I stepped closer to the edge and stared. Sometimes the mind does play tricks, I'll admit. You see something you can't quite make out, so your brain unintentionally fills in the missing details. Maybe I wanted to see a pale, lifeless face staring back up at me from that murky depth. Perhaps deep down I found the idea of a drowned figure beckoning to me intriguing. Maybe all I saw was the shadowy outline of the dead tree branch under the surface and a faint reflection of the light breaking through the canopy overhead. But whatever it truly was, I ran, dead twigs snapping and crunching beneath my feet, Belle at my side, and I never did look behind me because I was convinced that if I did, I would see it standing next to that dark pond, staring back. Walkie-talkies in the woods. From Jack 36. I recall a time back in the days when I was a kid. It may have not been the scariest experience I've had, but it certainly was bizarre in nature and makes me seriously question reality. Since I've become an adult, I haven't been hiking or exploring nearly as often for pretty obvious reasons. Having a job, tending to family, etc. I still try to go out every once in a while, and when I do, it brings back so much nostalgia. I've tried my best not to think about the bad experiences I've had out in the woods, but sometimes I can't help myself. Just a few days ago, when I was driving to get groceries, I went through a tunnel, and that's when my radio cut out. You know, the typical static you get when the broadcasting service isn't available, right? Well, there it was, as clear as ever. As I went through that tunnel, it gave me goosebumps. I'd never been one for that sound to begin with, but it only became worse as I encountered a flashback so vivid from long ago when I was only 10 years old. This is where the real story begins. It was your typical weekend afternoon, and I was with my friend Joe. We'd been lifelong buddies to that point in time, and we still continue to talk every now and then to this day. It was fall, so the leaves were in the process of changing color. It looked fantastic outside. We were in my backyard, admiring the forest that backed into my family's property. There was a vast amount of forest to explore back there, and we hadn't been through all of it just yet. We'd been obsessed with becoming army men back then, and we had the whole setup. Walkie-talkies, tactical pocket knives, camo backpacks, airsofts, and things of that nature. Joe interrupted the conversation we were having about my grade school crush, saying, "Hey, look, if you ask her to marry you, I think she'll say yes. Does that make you happy?" Just before suggesting we go play army in the forest. I grudgingly agreed, but at the same time I knew playing army guys would be a lot of fun. Basically, it was just tactical hide and seek, but with our wild imaginations, it was so much more. Joe said he'd try to capture me first, and I said okay. I ran a good amount into the forest and found a tree to climb up. Nature sounds were all around me. It was so calming outside. I then turned my walkie-talkie on and waited for him to call in and let me know he was on his way to find me. I sat there for a while. I spotted a deer eating berries from a bush not too far off. It hadn't noticed me yet. I just sat there observing it. Suddenly, my walkie-talkie started to give off major amounts of static. Something had happened. I knew I hadn't switched to any other channel, and that I remained on the one with my friend. High-pitched sounds started to emanate from the walkie-talkie. I saw the deer perk up and run away. I was completely alone then. I was frightened at this point and wasn't exactly sure what to do. Goosebumps enveloped my body. I was frozen in fear as the static slowly subsided to give way to some sort of demonic howl. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then all was silent. All of the wood's sounds were dead, and I heard absolutely nothing. I knew something was wrong, and I had to get out of there. As spontaneous as the static came, it had left, all at once. I turned off the walkie-talkie, jumped off the tree, and made a run for it back to my house. Joe was waiting for me there, a look of concern on his face. My parents were outside, visibly hysterical, phone in hand. They had called the police to send someone over to help locate me. As I ran out of the tree line towards them, my parents ran up to hug me. I was scared and confused. My parents asked how I got lost in the woods. I sat there puzzled, not knowing how to respond. All I could say was, I don't know. But apparently, I'd been gone for hours. Joe kept insisting that he had spoken through his walkie-talkie, trying to contact me countless times. After a while, he had given up and went back to tell my parents. Although I was in a new part of the woods, I was successfully able to trace my way back. What confused me was how we were both notably on the same channel, but I did not hear anything from him. What confused me any more was the time that I'd been out. I had no idea that I'd been out there that long. The time I'd been out felt so brief. Eventually, we cleared everything up with the police. My friend and I had a talk with my parents about not going in the forest again without supervision, and that was that. Only a week after that did Joe tell me something no one else knew. He said he didn't want to tell my parents because he was scared and didn't want to get in any trouble. He even had trouble bringing himself to tell me what he saw. Even though I never heard from him over the walkie-talkie, he claimed he saw someone who looked just like me. The figure's back was turned as Joe started running towards it. As he began to yell my name, whatever it was took an impossibly huge step away from him. Joe stopped dead in his tracks. Whoever it was then turned around to face him and slightly waved, a grin on their face. He claimed it was me. The only notable difference was my eyes. They were black. At that point, an unexplainable feeling of dread washed over him. The figure who looked just like me stood there staring at my friend. Joe ran as fast as he could back to my house, not looking back. He told me he didn't think he was chased or followed. When he got to my house, he simply said I was lost and I wouldn't pick up the walkie-talkie. He never mentioned anything else out of fear of what would happen if he did. To this day, we've kept that between ourselves. We've never told another soul. I still have no idea what happened that day, and I'm sharing this story in hopes that at least one person might have the slightest idea of what occurred. Even though I came up with some theories, None of them seemed quite plausible. I stayed out of those woods for a while. I never really ventured deep within them after what happened that afternoon. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. My parents still live in that house. With my own priorities, I've not been able to visit them all too often, but the next time I do, I think I'm going to go back in and see if anything has changed, or if I can at least find anything that's not quite right in those woods. I say this now with confidence, and I hope I can keep that confidence the day that I venture back in. But I'm not entirely sure if I'll do it. If I do, and anything happens, I'll give an update. The Wolf Whistler, from Wicked Wendigo. Quick preface. My uncle was a sheriff's deputy and search and rescue officer in the Northwest United States back in the 1990s. This experience is told from my uncle's view, with a few explanations from myself. He asked that I keep the location hidden for anonymity purposes. It was the summer of 1992. I was a couple years into my job with the county sheriff's office. Summers were busy, and a ton of people would go camping and hiking up here, so naturally people would occasionally get lost. Search and rescue was something I was voluntold to do as a rookie, but I learned to love it. Helping people, especially in life or death situations, was the reason I became a deputy. So search and rescue gave me that rush, as my normal law enforcement duties were almost always mundane in my small town. Anyway, here we go. We received a call from a lady in Arizona one Tuesday morning. She claimed her husband and young grandson had driven up here on Friday for a weekend camping trip. They hadn't returned on Monday as scheduled, and she was worried they were lost. So we geared up the search and rescue team consisting of myself, 4 other deputies, 15 civilian volunteers, and 2 bloodhound search and rescue dogs. We made it to their campsite around noon. Upon first inspection, everything in the camp seemed relatively normal. We searched their tent and found all their belongings sitting inside. Truck keys, wallet, map, water, food, all sat in the tent undisturbed. A small pot filled with water and now extra soggy macaroni noodles sat above a long dead fire pit. It was obvious they had left in a hurry. No tracks were visible to determine what direction they went, so we used a pair of socks we found inside the tent as a base smell for the hounds. They caught the scent and started leading us north of the campsite. As we walked, I looked at my partner and we both shook and lowered our heads. North of their campsite were tens of thousands of acres of dense woods. We knew this was going to be a long search. As we searched, we used a grid pattern. A grid pattern is roughly an acre-sized square on a map that search and rescue uses to determine a more precise direction that someone might have gone. The weirdest part was that the hounds would pick up their scent in one square, but none of the squares directly next to that one. This happened multiple times. It was like someone plucked these guys from their campsite and placed them in random sections of the forest, repeatedly. I began to get a very bad feeling after this. Something just didn't seem right about the situation. The team had covered roughly 3 miles of area as the day started to wind down. As dusk started to hit, it was just myself, my buddy Rob, and his hound Russ that stayed behind. The rest of the team made their way back home and would be back tomorrow by morning. I always stayed out overnight when a child was lost. I would get a feeling of guilt being in a warm, safe bed, knowing a child was cold and scared out in the wilderness. We eventually found a small clearing to make camp. By the time night fell, we had a fire blazing and our sleeping bags were laid out in the grass. Rob and I went over tomorrow's search plan for a bit, ate dinner, and eventually hunkered down for the evening. I lay on my sleeping bag, admiring the incredible number of stars as I began to doze off. I remember waking up sometime later. I sat up and looked around as my eyes began to adjust to the darkness. I felt as if someone was watching me. The urge to look around to ensure no one was sneaking up on me was intense. I called out, "Hello? Sam? Frank? Is that you? We're looking for you. Are you out there?" I didn't hear any response, so I lay down and tried to fall back to sleep. Just a few minutes later, I heard it. Somewhere to my left, past the tree line, came a loud wolf whistle. A wolf whistle is the whistle you hear in movies or TV when a man sees a very attractive woman. I sprang out of my sleeping bag and began frantically scanning the tree line. At this point, Russ was up too. His ears were peaked and he was whining in the direction of the whistle. I called out again. "Hello, I'm a deputy with the sheriff's office. Do you need help? Sam, Frank." I received no response. Rob was awake now, and as I was explaining the situation, the whistle came again, but this time it was from our right. I drew my sidearm and flicked on my flashlight as Rob took out his large buck knife and stood beside me. We scanned the tree line, but we didn't see anything. We continued scanning the tree line, calling out for another 10 minutes before we decided to get the fire going again and wait until dawn to search the area. We didn't hear another whistle for the remainder of the early morning. As dawn broke, Rob and I searched the area. We found 2 pairs of boot prints in the fresh mud. We decided to head back home, get some rest, and return later in the day to continue searching. We were only about 200 feet from the clearing when 2 simultaneous wolf whistles came from behind us. As I turned, I scanned the trees. I didn't see anything at first, but as I looked farther back towards the entrance of the clearing, I saw 2 silhouettes standing out in the open. We couldn't see any features or clothing as the morning sun was blinding us. I called out and started making my way towards them when they suddenly took off running. I was going to chase them when Rob stopped me. I was puzzled. I said, "Rob, what? We're looking for 2 people and there they are. Stop wasting time." He replied with, "Stop and think for a second. We're looking for 1 male adult and 1 male child. Unless that kid is the next Randy Brewer. There's no way he's that tall at age 11. That's when the realization hit me. He was right. Those 2 silhouettes obviously were not the 2 people we were searching for. If I was alone or with another deputy, I would have chased them, but I wasn't willing to put a civilian volunteer in danger. We decided to just continue our way back to the trailhead and debrief the team and sheriff on the events that had transpired. The rest of the hike back to the trailhead was uneventful. We met up with the search team and the sheriff when we arrived, as they were getting geared up to head back out. We received a few scoffs and eye rolls when retelling the events that occurred, but the sheriff surprisingly believed our claims. He even had one of the deputies carry an M16 for the remainder of the search. We continued our search for 13 days, never finding the 2 individuals. A few people claimed they heard wolf whistles while out searching, but I never did hear them again. This mission still haunts me. I've wondered all these years what happened to those 2, and if the 2 silhouettes had something to do with their disappearance. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.